In the summer of 2013, a small science company in Scotland ran a quiet, ordinary test. They were not hunting for a scandal. They were not trying to embarrass anyone. They only wanted to read the story written inside a few drops of human saliva, the way they had done hundreds of times before. What they found stopped them cold. The sample belonged to the family of Princess Diana, and hidden inside it was a genetic marker so rare that, at the time, only 14 people on the entire planet were known to carry it. 13 of those 14 lived in India. One lived in Nepal. Not a single one came from Britain. Not one came from anywhere in Europe. The scientists ran it again. Then a third time. The answer refused to change. The future king of England, a boy descended from a long line of pale northern monarchs, carried the genetic signature of an Indian woman who had been dead for almost 200 years. A woman his family had spent generations pretending was someone else entirely. This is the story of how that truth was buried, and how a few strands of DNA finally dragged it back into the light. Her name was Eliza Kework. If you have never heard it, that is not an accident. People worked very hard for a very long time to make sure you never would. To understand who she was, you have to travel back to a port city on the western coast of India around the year 1790. The city was Surat in what is now Gujarat. Today Surat is famous for diamonds. Nearly all of the world's diamonds are cut and polished there. But 200 years ago it was famous for something else. It was one of the busiest trading harbors in the world. Ships came from everywhere. Merchants from Arabia, from Persia, from Armenia, from England and Scotland, all crowded into the same narrow streets. Spices, cotton, silk, and silver moved through the docks every single day. Fortunes were made in a season and lost in a week. And running through the middle of all of it was the East India Company, the British trading giant that ruled large parts of India long before the British government officially took over. Eliza was born into this world. We know very little about her early life, and that itself tells you something. Powerful people leave behind paperwork. Forgotten people leave behind almost nothing. What the records do suggest is that her father may have been an Armenian trader. Her surname, Kework, is close to an old Armenian name, and letters written to her were in Armenian script. The Armenian community had lived and worked in India for centuries by then, building churches and running businesses. But her mother was Indian. That part is not a guess. That part is written in her DNA, passed down mother to daughter, all the way to a future English king. So Eliza grew up as a mixed heritage woman in a colonial port town. And then, somewhere in those crowded streets, she met a young Scotsman named Theodore Forbes. Theodore was born in 1788 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. He was a third son. In Britain at that time, being a third son was almost a sentence. The oldest son inherited the family land. The second son might get something smaller. The third son got a handshake and a suggestion to go make his own way in the world. So Theodore did what thousands of ambitious, broke young British men did. He sailed to India to work for the East India Company and chase a fortune that home would never give him. He needed someone to run his household. He hired Eliza. The word they used for her in the records was housekeeper, but that word was carrying a great deal more weight than it appears to. Historians who have studied this period are clear about what it usually meant. Many British men in India kept Indian or mixed heritage women in their homes, women they lived with, slept with, and had children with, but never married and rarely acknowledged in public. These were not partnerships of equals. The man held all the power. The woman held none. And when it ended, it almost always ended badly for her. Eliza and Theodore had children together. A daughter named Catherine, born in 1812. A son, Alexander, 2 years later, and a third child as well. For a few years in that house in India, they were something like a family. But Theodore never married her. In his own letters and documents, he called Eliza his housekeeper. In one record, he referred to her as the purported mother of his own daughter, as if her place in her children's lives was a thing he could question. Sit with that word for a moment. Purported. He is writing about the woman who carried and raised his child, and he chooses a word that holds her at arm's length, that quietly suggests she might not even count. That single word tells you everything about how he saw her: useful, temporary, replaceable. And then came the part of the story that is genuinely hard to read. Theodore decided to go home to Britain, and he decided to take his daughter Catherine with him. She was just a child. He pulled her out of the only world she had ever known, away from the heat and noise and color of the Indian coast, and pointed her toward a cold, gray country she had never seen. He left her mother behind. Imagine being a small girl told that you are leaving forever, that you will cross an ocean and never come back, and that the woman who raised you is not coming with you. Imagine Eliza standing on that shore. We do not know what she said. We do not know if she fought it or begged or simply broke. There are letters that suggest she wrote to Theodore asking, pleading, but the decision was not hers to make. It was never going to be hers. She had no power, no money, no rights, no name that mattered to the men who ran the world. Eliza Keyork never saw her daughter again. And here is the cruelest part of all. We do not know what happened to her after that. There is no record of where she went, no record of when she died, no grave that anyone can point to with certainty. The woman who would one day be the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of a king simply vanished from the page of history, alone, in a country and ocean away from her own child. Her daughter Catherine sailed on to Scotland and grew up inside British society. She was given an education. She was taught manners, taught how to speak, how to dress, how to belong. And she was taught one more thing, quietly and firmly. She was taught not to talk about her mother. Because by now a problem was beginning to form. Catherine was half Indian, and in the Britain she was growing into, that was not a small thing. It was a stain. This was the age of empire. Britain ruled India and much of the world, and it told itself a story to justify that rule, a story in which white Europeans sat at the top of nature's ladder and everyone else sat somewhere below. The upper classes were obsessed with blood and breeding. Who your parents were decided who you could marry, where you could go, what doors would open. To have Indian ancestry, what they ugly called colored blood, could quietly ruin a family standing for generations. Catherine had married into respectable Scottish society. Her children would need to marry well too, and a half-Indian grandmother was a secret that could sink them all. So the family made a choice. They could not erase Eliza completely. Too many people knew Catherine had a mother, but they could change who that mother was. And so Eliza Keyork, the Indian woman from Surat, was quietly rewritten as Armenian. It was a clever lie in its cold way. Armenia was exotic enough to explain her foreign name and her dark looks, but it was also European and Christian, home to one of the oldest Christian communities on earth. Armenian was acceptable. Indian was not. In some family papers she was even given a fancier, more European-sounding version of her name, dressed up to sound respectable. The Indian woman was buried, and an Armenian invention was put in her place. And the lie held. That is the astonishing thing. It did not last a few years. It lasted nearly 2 centuries. Follow the thread forward and you can watch it travel down the generations. Catherine had a daughter. That daughter had a daughter. Each one passed down the same tiny piece of Indian DNA hidden inside her body, while the family story said something completely different out loud. With every generation, the Indian heritage faded a little more from their faces and their features, but it never faded from the genes. It could not. That kind of DNA does not dilute. It simply passes, unchanged, from mother to child, like a sealed letter handed down a line of women who had no idea what it said. That line eventually produced a woman named Frances, and Frances married into one of the grandest families in Britain. On a June morning in 1954, she walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey to marry Viscount Althorp, an heir to an earldom. She was only 18 years old, one of the youngest brides ever to marry in that great church. The Queen was there. The Queen Mother was there. Princesses sat in the pews. The press covered every detail of the dress and the flowers and the vows. And not one person in that cathedral knew, or at least not one person said, that the radiant young bride carried Indian blood, that somewhere in her cells sat a marker passed down from a forgotten woman in Surat, a woman who had been written out of the family more than a century before. Frances and her husband had several children. One of them, born on a summer day in 1961, was a girl named Diana. You know what happened to Diana. The whole world knows. She grew up on an estate near the royal family, played as a child with young princes, and then, in 1981, became the most famous woman alive when she married Prince Charles. 750 million people watched that wedding on television. They called it the wedding of the century. A shy young woman in an enormous dress, a fairy tale beamed into living rooms across the planet. And on that day, as on every day before it, the old lie still stood. The official family story still listed Eliza Kework as Armenian. The secret was safe. The people guarding it must have thought it was safe forever. They had not counted on science. Because deep inside Diana's body, in a place no portrait painter or society gossip could ever reach, sat the truth. It lived in her mitochondria, the tiny structures inside her cells that act like little power plants. Mitochondria carry their own small set of genes, and those genes have a strange and beautiful property. You inherit them only from your mother, not your father, only your mother. Which means they travel in a perfect unbroken chain. Daughter from mother, from her mother, from her mother, stretching back through time almost completely unchanged. Diana carried the same mitochondrial DNA as her mother Frances. Frances carried the same as her mother. And on back through Catherine, all the way to Eliza Kework herself. A 200-year-old message, written in a code no one in the family could read, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally open it. That someone was a geneticist named Dr. Jim Wilson, working with a company that studied British ancestry. His team did something simple but powerful. They found 2 living people who descended from Eliza through that same unbroken female line, distant cousins of Diana, and they tested their mitochondrial DNA. Because of how this kind of DNA works, whatever those cousins carried, Diana carried too, and so did her sons. The results came back, and they did not match anything the family expected. The DNA belonged to a rare group that scientists label R30b. When Wilson's team searched the global databases, comparing against tens of thousands of people from around the world, they found that this exact lineage had shown up in only 14 recorded cases. 13 of those people were Indian. 1 was Nepalese. The marker was rare even in India itself, carried by a tiny fraction of the population. And an exact match to Eliza's particular version had not turned up anywhere on Earth. This is the moment the experts were truly baffled, not because the science was unclear, but because of what it meant. Here was the bloodline of the British royal family, the very symbol of English heritage, and it led straight back to the Indian subcontinent. Wilson described the evidence as unassailable. To be thorough, the team checked another type of DNA too, scattered across the rest of the genome, and found traces of South Asian ancestry there as well. There was no mistake. Eliza Kework of Surat had been Indian, exactly as her hidden genes had been quietly insisting for 2 centuries. When the findings were announced in June 2013, they went around the world in hours. Prince William, second in line to the British throne, had Indian ancestry. By the math of generations, he is roughly 1 part in 256 Indian. It is a small fraction, but it is real, and it is recorded forever now in the science. When William one day becomes king, he will be the first British monarch with confirmed Indian roots. Think about the weight of that. This is a country that once ruled India, that built an empire on the idea that Indians were lesser, that taught its children that British blood was finer than the blood of the people it governed. And the future head of that very monarchy carries in his cells the inheritance of an Indian woman his own family tried to erase precisely because she was Indian. History does not usually offer irony that sharp. The reactions told their own story. Diana's maternal aunt, a woman named Mary Roch, spoke to the press, and her response was warm and open. She said she had always believed she was part Armenian, and that she was delighted to learn she was also part Indian. No shame, no discomfort. Just pleasure at discovering a richer story than the one she had been handed. In a single sentence, she showed how far the world had moved since the days when this exact heritage was treated as something to hide. But the inner royal family said nothing at all. No statement came from the palace. William and Harry, who carry Eliza's marker directly, never spoke publicly about it. William traveled to India a few years later for official royal duties, but the visit was not built around his ancestry, and the connection was never highlighted. The silence was striking. The British government, eager at the time to strengthen trade ties with India, could have made a great deal of this story. A future king with Indian roots is the kind of bridge that politicians dream of. And yet the moment came and went, officially unremarked. Maybe the family simply guards its privacy as it has every right to do. Maybe there was nothing to say. Or maybe, even now, even in our supposedly modern age, the truth still sits a little awkwardly inside those palace walls. We cannot know. That too is part of the story. Eliza was silenced once by shame and met, 2 centuries later, with a different kind of silence. It would be easy to treat all of this as a piece of royal trivia, a fun fact about a famous family. But that would be the smallest way to read it, because Eliza Keyork was not the only one. During the long years of British rule in India, there were many Elizas. Countless Indian women lived in arrangements like hers, useful to powerful men until they were not. Countless mixed-heritage children were taken from their mothers and raised to deny half of where they came from. Most of them left no letters, no portraits, no famous descendants to make scientists curious. Their names were not just hidden. They were never written down at all. Eliza's story survived only because, by sheer chance, her bloodline ran forward into a princess and a king. For every Eliza we can name, there were thousands we never will. That is the real reason this story matters. It is not about the royal family. It is about everyone the official version of history quietly left out. So what is there to take from all of this, in the end? The first thing is simple. The truth tends to come out. It may take a year or a lifetime or 2 full centuries, but secrets are heavier than people think, and the things we bury have a way of working their way back to the surface. Eliza waited 200 years. She still got there. The second thing is harder. The version of history we are handed is almost never the whole of it. It is written by the people with power and shaped to protect them. And the people who get edited out are usually the ones who had no power to begin with. A family tree is not just a record of who existed. It is also a record of who someone decided to keep and who they decided to erase. The third thing is the cost of it all. Our obsession with purity, whether it wears the mask of race or class or blood, is not harmless. It does not stay in the books and the records. It reaches into real lives and tears them apart. Eliza lost her children. Catherine lost her mother. Generations of their descendants lost any knowledge of where they truly came from. All of that pain, traced back, began with the idea that one kind of person was worth more than another. And the last thing is a small note of grace. Dr. Wilson and his team did not set out to right a historical wrong. They were scientists doing research. But in reading a few strands of DNA, they handed a voice back to a woman who had been silenced for 200 years. They could not undo what was done to her. No one can, but they could at least make sure she would not stay erased. We still do not know where Eliza Keyork is buried. Somewhere in India, perhaps, there is a marker with her name on it. Perhaps there is nothing at all. We may never find out, but we do know that she was real. She lived. She loved her children. She was torn away from them through no fault of her own, by men who decided her life was an inconvenience and her heritage an embarrassment. She deserved so much better than to be deleted. And now, because of a science she could never have imagined, she will not be. So the next time you hear about royal bloodlines, about noble families and pure ancestry and the grand old names of history, remember Eliza. Remember that behind every carefully drawn family tree are the people who were quietly cut out of it, the branches that were pruned away, the roots that were hidden underground because someone decided they were the wrong color. History is not only the version that got written down. Sometimes the truest story is the one that someone tried hardest to erase. And sometimes, 200 years later, the answer is still there, waiting patiently inside the body of a future king, ready for anyone brave enough or curious enough to finally read it.